of Christ as recorded in the book. I hope everyone can hear me all right. My phone's giving me indications that there might be connection issues, but it's not showing me that again. So let's try this again. Welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We're studying those books, and we're studying about Jesus. In the last session, we talked a little bit about some of the miracles of Christ. We had gone through another one of those sections of teaching, and so now we're back into some of the miracles and some of the kind of minor miracles in Jesus' life. This time, we're going to get into something a little bit more famous and a little bit more unique than the ones we went over last time. We're going to be talking about the Transfiguration. Now, this can be found in Matthew chapter 17, Mark chapter 9, and Luke chapter 9. But we're going to be camping out in Mark's account for today because he's actually going to be the most detailed for us, which is a little non-typical. But we're definitely starting in with Mark. So let's go ahead and read Mark chapter 9, beginning in verse 2. And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. Now let's pause there for a moment because the term transfiguration is a little bit difficult because honestly, I don't think I've ever heard it used out of this extremely specific context. What transfiguration means is that the form of Christ changed. So it's not transformation. He didn't become something else. And it's not illusion. It didn't appear to be something else, but something about his physical form changed. And luckily, the Bible tells us pretty much exactly what that transfiguration was. In verse 3, and his clothes became radiant, intensely white, as no one on earth could bleach them. So here's a scene that we see happening. Jesus takes his three closest companions among the disciples, Peter, James, and John. He goes up on a mountain, and suddenly as they're walking, he is transfigured. That means his form changed, and he begins to shine. His clothes turn bright white, and he begins to shine brightly. Obviously, there's something going on here, and it's going to be a lot different than the nature of many of the miracles we've seen so far. This is actually a great example of the real purpose of miracles, as we'll see in a little bit. But let's continue. Verse 4. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. All right. So as they're walking along, suddenly Jesus starts shining brightly, and appearing beside him are Moses and Elijah. It appears that Peter instantly knows that this is Moses and Elijah. Now, given that there were no photos of Moses or Elijah, I don't know how he instantly knew that. Maybe there was something about the conversation, because apparently there was conversation between Moses, Jesus, and Elijah at this particular moment. I do think this was probably the real Moses and the real Elijah, by the way. I think God sent them very temporarily back to earth to have this conversation with Christ. Now, of course, I'd be interested to see what that conversation is, and it'd be fascinating. I mean, what on earth would they be talking about? And part of the reason that's so interesting is just because of the perspective that Moses and Elijah surely would have had at that point. You know, for the same reason I find it interesting the conversations that demons actually have with Jesus, because they have the perspective that most people around him do not, which is they know exactly who they are talking to. They're talking to the Son of God. They know about the nature of his upcoming kingdom, all of this. So man, I wish I could have been there for that conversation, but I assume that the contents of that conversation are not recorded for a good reason. Maybe just because, for whatever reason, it's not relevant to us. But for whatever reason, Peter recognizes these two as Moses and Elijah. And he says, it is good that they are here. We should build 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, this phrase, we should build 3 tents, I've heard 2 different ideas on this. One is the more obvious, which he's talking about actual tents. He's just talking about a place of shelter. But the other one, and the one I tend to lean towards, is he's not just talking about normal tents. The word tent in the Bible, it pops up a lot, and it's always the same word, but it can be used to describe different things. And often in our English Bibles, different words will be used to describe these different types of tents. And that's often guesswork on the part of the translator. It's much like the word angel, which comes from the word angelos, which just means messenger. And so if you see the word angel in the New Testament in particular, that usually means that that's the translator taking a guess that this is not just any old ordinary messenger who's come up, but this is actually an angel of God. And, I typically think they're correct. I can't think of any place where I've seen where they translated angel. Well, actually, I said that, and honestly, the term angel shows up a few times in the first couple chapters of Revelation, and I've seen good argument to suggest that the better translator actually might be messenger, talking about human messengers. But I'm getting off the topic here. What we need to understand here is Peter might be referring to tent as in a place of worship. The word for tabernacle really is the same as tent. And so maybe Peter is suggesting that they are to put these three places of either worship or extremely high honor in favor of all three of these men. Now, a question might show up. Why on earth is it these? Well, you have Jesus, which is obvious, but why Moses and Elijah? And the usual thought with that is that these two were put up there because they are both representing eras. And when you consider Jesus, he also represents an era. The Jews tended to think of the Old Testament into two parts, the law and the prophets. Today, what they would have called the law, we call the Pentateuch. That's the first 5 books of the Bible written by Moses, and so Moses is pretty well associated with the law. Among the prophets, even though that includes the books of history and of poetry, you usually think of what we today call the prophets. You see, when we divide up the Old Testament, you have the Pentateuch, you have the books of history, you have the books of poetry, and then you have the minor prophets, and then you have the major prophets. I said that in the wrong order, but who cares? The Jews would have just called all of that, though, the prophets. And you have a representative of the prophets because Elijah is an extremely important character in the history of those sections. Very righteous character as well, one who really stands out. So you have Moses as a representative of the first part of the Old Testament. You have Elijah as a representative of the second part of the Old Testament. And then you have Jesus, who we might go so far as to say is also representative. He represents the New Testament. So you have this scene. Jesus is shining. The way the Bible makes it sound like the disciples are having trouble even looking at him. For whatever reason, they can tell that he is talking to Moses and Elijah. Peter, who, as we have already mentioned, he is defined by his impulsiveness. Sometimes it is absolutely fantastic that he is impulsive. And other times, it's, come on, man, you got to think before you act. But in this case, his impulsiveness is probably a little bit of a bad thing. Not something that's going to require a huge correction, but will require some correction. He says, let's make tents for all three of you. I think he meant some sort of worshipful idea behind that. And then suddenly the bright light shines. And actually, I don't think we've read that far yet, so let's get there. Verse 6, for he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. So apparently this was a terrifying sight, which is often the case with these big displays of the power of God. Verse 7, and a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only. So suddenly, the light around Jesus, it gets bigger, and they can't look at all. And as the light has completely it's overpowering, there's a great voice. Very similar, by the way, in phrasing to what we see during the baptism of Jesus. And it says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Actually, I might have misquoted that. Let me check that. And the reason I would have misquoted that is because it's so extremely similar to what happens at the baptism. This is my beloved Son, listen to him. See, I added "in whom I am well pleased" from the baptism, but that just goes to show you how extremely close it is to what happens during the baptism of Christ. "And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but Jesus only." All right. So here's the scene. They're walking up this mountain. Suddenly, Jesus starts shining intensely brightly. They're all terrified. Suddenly, these two men that, for whatever reason, either through supernatural means or perhaps just because they've been identified to them, they know are Moses and Elijah. Peter is trying to do something, and so he says, "Let's make tabernacles, places of worship for the three of you." And then that's when the light comes out. There's that light. There's that voice that says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And when the light recedes, Jesus is left standing there. We'll get to what this means here in a second. Verse 9, "And as they were coming down from the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept that matter to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead might mean. And they asked him, 'Why do the scribes say that first Elijah must come?' And he said to them, 'Elijah does come first to restore all things, and how it is written of the Son of Man that he should suffer many things and be treated with contempt. But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as is written of him.'" All right. After this, they're going down. Jesus tells them not to tell anybody about this until he has risen from the dead. Matthew tells us that they start questioning among themselves, what does he mean when he says he's going to rise from the dead? By the way, he means he's going to rise from the dead. There's no. We might be able to sympathize a little bit. Maybe he means some other kind of resurrection. I mean, we do know that sometimes Jesus would say things and he wouldn't exactly mean it literally, right? Or at least physically. Maybe that'd be a better way to put it. Obviously, when he talks about his kingdom, he's not talking about a physical kingdom. He's talking about a spiritual kingdom. And so maybe they think this is some sort of spiritual resurrection. They're not really sure. It would later become pretty clear that when he was talking about his resurrection, he was talking about a physical resurrection. They also have another question, though. Why did God say Elijah? This looked like this was the chance. We see in the Old Testament, one of the very last, in fact, the last prophecy of the Old Testament, God says, "I'm going to be sending you Elijah, and he's going to turn the hearts of the fathers to their sons and the sons of the fathers," etc., etc. So they're asking, why is that prophet there, or that prophecy there? I mean, that looked like the opportunity. That was Elijah, along with Moses. Why, where? By the way, I almost by the way to myself, and I'm going to wait just a moment to give you this little by the way. That was Elijah along with Moses. This seemed like the time. Why didn't he do anything? Why was he here just for a second and then disappeared? And then Jesus said Elijah was already here. One of the other gospel accounts, not Matthew, tells us that at that point they understood that he was talking about John the Baptist, which, by the way, we have already seen that John the Baptist did come in the spirit of Elijah. So when God said Elijah was coming, he did not mean the literal Elijah, which for some people might be reasonable. After all, Elijah physically was taken up to heaven. He never died. So, maybe he'll come on back down. But no, that's not what it meant. It was talking about John the Baptist, who would come in the spirit of Elijah and act as a forerunner. All right. Now for my little interesting by the way. Both Moses and Elijah, we already talked about the significance of them being that Moses sort of represents the first part of the Old Testament. Elijah represents the second part of the Old Testament. Both Moses and Elijah are also extremely crucial in setting up the Christ when it comes to Old Testament prophecy. We've already talked about how Elijah is important, how he is the center of the last prophecy of Christ. Well, you might say that Moses is the center of the first prophecy of Christ. in that, of course, he records it for us. There's a little bit of controversy as to when the first prophecy of Christ really shows up. I think it's Genesis 3:15, when God says, this was after Adam and Eve were caught after their sin in the garden, and God is doling out punishments to man. He's going to have to work and toil on cursed ground. The woman was going to have great pain in labor. And then he's talking to the serpent. First thing he says, on your belly you shall go. We typically think that means that maybe snakes at the beginning had legs, but we don't really know exactly what that means. But then he also says this, in Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. And you shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head. Generally, this is thought to be a prophecy of Christ. I think especially when you look at the strange phrasing that Eve has at the birth of Cain, it seems that she was certainly anticipating Christ may be coming at that time. Obviously, Cain wasn't Christ. That's what I think the first prophecy of Christ is. But if you don't think that's it, then you almost certainly think that Genesis chapter 12 is the first prophecy of Christ. In fact, the New Testament does confirm for us that this is talking about Christ when in the promise to Abraham to go to this land, he said, I will make of you a great nation, and in you all the families of the world shall be blessed. He wasn't actually talking about the entire nation of Israel at that point. He was talking about one who would come from that nation. He was talking about Jesus. And again, the New Testament confirms that for us. So Moses writes the first prophecy of Christ. Elijah is the recipient or the subject of the last prophecy of Christ. And one more thing as far as Moses goes that's pretty interesting. One of the last things that Moses said during his lifetime, so this isn't something that he recorded for us, it's something that he said, is that the Lord God will send unto you a prophet like me. To him you shall listen. And again, by the way, the New Testament confirms for us this is talking about Christ. So you have this prophecy from Moses all the way up to Elijah talking about Christ. Both of them are going to be talking about how they are going to be coming to do something better as well. One moment, please. Professionalism. They're going to do something better. And that's what the real purpose, at least to me, of the Transfiguration is. One, this is not exactly what I've been talking about. Purpose number one, though, was to confirm exactly who Jesus was. We've already seen it at his baptism, and now we are seeing it again being confirmed by God. But two, it was to show that this is better, that this is something that supersedes that. As Jesus would say in Matthew chapter 5, I have not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. That's why God says, here, it's to him you shall listen. I don't usually bring this up to people who believe we should still be following, to some extent, the Old Testament. Although, by the way, I should mention, I've yet to find somebody who believes we should be following the entirety of the Old Testament, and so it's sort of a self-defeating doctrine. But normally I go into places such as Matthew chapter 5, or we might go into Romans talking about how the old law was not sufficient, Hebrews talking about how the old law was not sufficient. But here's an interesting spot I don't normally go to, but I wonder what the response is. What was the purpose of this miracle if not to tell us, don't listen to that old law? I mean, it's not to say there's no value, but as far as law goes, what we are to obey, listen to Jesus. Don't listen to Moses. Don't listen to Elijah. Listen to Jesus. That's the point of this anyway. All right. We got a little bit of time remaining, so let's go into one more miracle. Oh! One more thing I wanted to mention about this. This place does have an alleged contradiction, which are pretty common throughout the Gospels. And it's a pretty easy one to solve. The reason we have a contradiction is when you look at Matthew's account, that's Matthew chapter, what did I say, 17? I think it's 17. Matthew chapter 17, Mark chapter 9, Luke chapter 9. Each of them give us a time that this happened. And each time it's after Jesus had foretold his own resurrection. The difference is how much time. Matthew says 6 days, Mark says 6 days, Luke says about 8 days. And Honestly, it's almost not worth our time to discuss it because the answer is so ridiculously obvious. Because the key word that Luke says is about. Well, I've got news for you. 6 days is about 8 days. The word about means it's somewhere near there, which is completely subjective. But if you were to ask me, I would probably give you 3 days on either side. So if it had happened 5 days before, I wouldn't be worried. Or if it happened 5 days after what he said, I still wouldn't be worried about it. So that's obviously not a contradiction. 6 days is about 8 days. If you want to get into, well, why is this divinely inspired writer not being specific about it? Well, you don't need to bring the other two gospels in. First of all, you're just talking against the idea of being very general about how much time we're talking about, which when you frame it like that, it sort of shows why it's so silly. Why can't a divinely inspired writer be a little more general and not necessarily super specific on every single detail? So yeah, not really a contradiction there. Okay. This next miracle that we want to go over, Matthew chapter 9 still, Mark chapter 9, or I'm sorry, Matthew chapter 17 still, Mark chapter 9 still, Luke chapter 9 still. And we're going to stay in Mark's account because, again, he's pretty detailed about it. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a crowd around them and scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able to." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy and fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into a fire or into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." There are certain people who try to interpret the Bible in a naturalistic way. That is to say, anything that you see in the Bible that looks miraculous, well, there's a natural explanation for it. It's not a very wise way to look at the Bible because there's just so much where it's very clearly showing the supernatural. If you do not believe in the supernatural, I'm sorry, your beliefs are just not compatible with Scripture. Well, I do believe in the supernatural. I don't necessarily believe that we see some of the same supernatural events that they did at that day, but I definitely believe in the supernatural. So somebody naturalistic might look at this example. By the way, they're coming down from the mountain and Jesus sees that there is an argument between his disciples and some of the great crowd. And what the argument was is apparently this man had his son who is possessed with a demon, and he tried to get the other disciples to cast it out, and they couldn't do it, which is one of those strange details from the Gospels that just always fascinates me, why you have even righteous men sometimes who are unable to cast out demons. You know, it just has something to do with a world that, frankly, I don't understand, and I don't think anybody does. But they're unable to cast this out. So what's the argument about? But then they just start describing what's been going on to this man's son. It says it's a deaf and mute spirit, and I assume that means that it caused the boy to be deaf and mute. But then he causes seizures upon him. And when you look at this, it looks extremely similar to epilepsy. You know, if you've ever seen somebody have a seizure, you know it's a pretty scary thing. That's pretty well what's being described over here. I've seen a couple of epileptic episodes in my life. I've never seen anybody foaming at the mouth, but pretty much everything else seems pretty much in tune with that. And so somebody looking at the Bible naturalistically will say, well, there was never actually a demon there. This was just a case of somebody with epilepsy. Well, you got a couple of problems. Problem number one, it's just as miraculous to cure epilepsy by touching somebody as it is to cast out a demon by touching somebody. So this is not really a naturalistic explanation at all. And two, epilepsy is not selective. What I mean by that is this. If you have seizures, you might have occasionally a seizure in an extremely dangerous place. I once had somebody have a seizure in front of me while I was driving. They had a seizure. They sort of bounced their way out on the road and fell right down in front of my car. Now, luckily, I was going slow and they were still a far way off, so I didn't hurt them. Thank goodness. But it doesn't wait until the most dangerous position. You're in the most dangerous position every time. Did you notice what it said about what this poor boy would happen with the epilepsy? It would wait. The demon would wait to cause a seizure, and he sees, oh, you're really close to a fire right now. That's when you're going to have the seizure. It'll cast you right into the fire. Oh, look, you're near some water right now. We'll drown you. And it is so easy sometimes when you're just reading the Bible, because the Bible, generally speaking, does not take you to a super personal place. It's not an entertainment book. It's not trying to make you feel certain things all the time. But when you remember the human element of this, think about just how terrifying this must have been. Could you imagine being this boy's father or this boy's mother? Having to constantly watch over him. You leave him in a spot that's dangerous for just, and you turn your back, you might lose that boy forever. It would have been terrifying. Anybody who's seen a seizure knows it's a scary thing to watch, but it's happening all the time. And you know a demon is involved with it. It would have been terrifying. You know, I've mentioned this before. I do think, the famous horror movie, The Exorcist, I think it does provide us one service. I'm not suggesting it for theological purposes, but I do think it helps us understand one thing. Demon possession is terrifying, and honestly, it would often look very similar to what we see here. So let's go on. Verse 23, and Jesus said to him, if you can, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe, help my unbelief. I think that phrase is one of the most theologically deep statements we hear somebody make where there is good reason to believe they don't necessarily understand all the implications behind it. But man, did he just say a mouthful. Jesus said all things are possible for he who believes. And the man, and the way I read it is desperation. He says, I believe, help my unbelief. Because what I think he just heard Jesus say, and it's not actually what Jesus said, but what I think he just heard Jesus say was, if you had more belief, we'd be able to cast him out. And the man says, well, I have some belief, but I also recognize my faith sometimes wavers. Help my unbelief. And it's one of the great statements of faith in the Bible. Don't ever let somebody fool you into thinking belief is something that is A, blind, that B, is completely destroyed the second you ever doubt anything ever, and 3, not something that can be strengthened. We ought to say, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. So, verse 25, and when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, you mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, and most of them said, he is dead. So the demon comes out after he is rebuked by Jesus, and the boy convulses terribly, the Bible says. Again, you have to imagine that horror movie scene. And then when it's done, it says he's like a corpse. He's just lying there. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up. He arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. That last phrase, that last couple sentences drive me absolutely crazy. What on earth do you mean that this kind of demon can't be? There's kinds of demons, and some of the disciples aren't able to cast them out. I don't know anything about it. It's a world that fascinates me, and I know absolutely nothing about. And truthfully, it's probably for the best. We don't know more about demons than we do. But there was something strange about that particular incident, and that's all I can tell you about it. All right. I think that just about wraps up our time for today. We'll be talking more about some of the miracles of Christ next week. Until then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Thank you.